The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Sarah Chen pushed through the employee entrance at Mercy General, Norfolk. 20 years. 20 years of arriving before dark, leaving after dark, existing in the spaces between shifts where nobody asked questions. Her name badge read simply, Chen, RN, the kind of anonymity that required deliberate construction, the kind that only worked if you were invisible enough, quiet enough, forgettable enough. She moved through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to occupy space without claiming it. The pediatric floor on night shift was a particular kind of quiet, the hum of ventilators, the occasional beep of a monitor, the distant murmur of parents trying to sleep in uncomfortable chairs beside their children. Sarah knew every corner of this floor. She knew which tiles creaked, which supply closets had burnt out overhead lights, which nurses' stations had working pens. She'd made a study of invisibility. The locker room smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of 1,000 shifts. She opened her assigned locker, 247, and hung her light jacket on the hook. Behind her own scrubs, tucked into the very back corner where the fluorescent light didn't quite reach, sat a pair of combat boots. Leather the color of old rust, laces frayed at the ends, soles worn smooth from desert sand that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. The boots had been there for 14 years. She kept them wrapped in a hospital towel, and she never let anyone see them. Her hands moved to close the locker door quickly, muscle memory responding faster than thought. Tremor in her fingertips. She pressed her palm flat against the cool metal and held it there for 3 seconds. Control. Always control. The charge nurse, Janet, stood at the main desk reviewing assignments. She didn't look up when Sarah approached. Nobody really looked at Sarah anymore, not once they decided who she was. A quiet floor nurse. A reliable set of hands. Someone who showed up, did the work, asked no questions, told no stories. Room for 07, Janet said, sliding the chart across the desk. 8-year-old. Pediatric admission, 72 hours post-op from a cochlear implant surgery that didn't take. Parents are still processing. Dad's military, be respectful. Janet finally glanced up. Just vitals and comfort care. The kid's scared. She's deaf, so no verbal communication yet. The hearing aids we tried didn't register properly. She's in distress, but we're managing it. Sarah took the chart. Room for 07. Emma Cartwright. Age 8. Admitted 3 days ago. And then she saw it, the father's name, listed in the emergency contact field. Marine General Robert Cartwright. Her vision narrowed for a moment, the way it always did when the past tried to crash through the wall she'd built. General Cartwright. The name hit like a physical thing, like a hand closing around her ribs. She'd never met him in person, but she knew his service record. She knew his command. She knew that he'd written a commendation for someone she used to be, back when she was still someone's wife, back when her hands held rifles instead of stethoscopes. She didn't say any of this to Janet. She simply nodded and turned toward the corridor. Room for 07 was at the far end of the pediatric wing, away from the main nursing station. The door was partially closed. Through the gap, Sarah could see a small figure in a hospital bed, and beyond her, a man in a chair, broad-shouldered, grey threading through dark hair, with the particular posture of someone accustomed to bearing weight that no human should have to carry. General Cartwright sat motionless, watching his daughter the way soldiers watch perimeters, with the exhaustion of someone who knows that vigilance is all that stands between safety and catastrophe. Sarah knocked softly and entered, moving into the space with the deliberate gentleness of someone trained to approach trauma without triggering it further. Good evening. I'm Sarah, your night nurse. She kept her voice low, steady, the voice of someone who'd learned to make herself smaller through sheer force of will. Just checking vitals. The general looked up. His eyes were the color of storm-gray concrete, and for a fraction of a second, Sarah wondered if he could see through her carefully constructed anonymity, if he somehow recognized the ghost of someone he'd once written about in official channels. But no, he was looking at a nurse. Just a nurse. That was the entire point. Emma lay in the hospital bed, her small body tense beneath the blanket, her eyes moving frantically between Sarah and her father. The girl's ears bore the fresh bandaging from the cochlear implant procedure, and her hands clutched the bedsheet like an anchor. Sarah could read the fear without words: fear of strangers, fear of needles, fear of sounds that weren't coming through yet, fear of a body that had betrayed her in ways children shouldn't have to understand. Sarah moved to the monitor first, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from 10,000 repetitions. She calibrated the blood pressure cuff, pediatric size, careful not to apply pressure that might frighten the child further, and waited for the reading. 105/62. Slightly elevated, consistent with post-operative stress and anxiety. She made a note on the chart, every movement deliberate, every gesture calibrated not to startle. Then she approached the bed slowly, giving Emma time to adjust to her presence. The girl's eyes widened. Her fingers tightened on the blanket. Sarah recognized the cascade of fear the girl couldn't hear, which meant she couldn't anticipate what was coming, couldn't hear reassurance in a voice. She was operating entirely on visual information, and visual information from a stranger in a healthcare setting was almost always a harbinger of pain. Sarah paused at the foot of the bed. She didn't reach for Emma immediately. Instead, she held up her hands, palms open, fingers relaxed, and made eye contact with the child. Then, slowly, deliberately, she pointed to herself and mouthed the word Sarah while making a small wave. She pointed to the blood pressure cuff in her other hand and mouthed checking while making a gentle squeezing motion. She had learned long ago that fear diminished when control was returned to the frightened person. Emma couldn't hear, but she could see. Prediction created safety. The general watched this exchange without comment. Sarah could feel his attention tracking her movements, assessing. She'd learned to work under observation. It was another skill from another life, one she never discussed. Emma's breathing slowed slightly. She nodded once, a tiny motion, permission granted. Sarah moved with the economy of motion that came from experience. The cuff went on gently, the Velcro fasteners soft against small skin. O2 sat was 98% on room air. Heart rate 91, still elevated but trending better. Temperature 98.6, normal. Sarah recorded everything on the monitor and made notes on the chart. All normal. All good. Nothing to fear from these vital signs, though she understood that Emma couldn't know that yet. She was preparing to leave when she noticed something. Emma's fear wasn't just general post-operative anxiety, there was something else embedded in it, something about the way the girl's hands moved. The child was trying to communicate something. Her fingers were moving in patterns, touching her fingers together, separating them, moving in what looked almost like a language Sarah recognized. Sign language. Emma was deaf, profoundly deaf according to the chart, but she was fluent in something, some form of communication that wasn't voice. Sarah made a mental note: the child's primary language wasn't verbal. The medical team had been trying to establish communication through voice, through speaking louder or slower or with more exaggerated enunciation, through hearing aids and post-operative sound therapy. But Emma's brain was wired for visual language, for hands and space and the grammar of motion. The girl wasn't being difficult or uncooperative, she was surrounded by people trying to speak to her in a language she couldn't process, and the cognitive load of that, the stress of it, was written across her small body in tension and fear. Sarah understood this with a clarity that felt almost like remembering something she'd once known. She understood isolation. She understood the specific terror of being surrounded by people who were trying to help but couldn't quite reach you because they were speaking the wrong language. She was considering how to approach this, how to suggest an alternative to the standard post-operative protocol, when the door to room 407 opened with more force than necessary. Dr. Marcus Hargrove entered like a man who moved through the world expecting it to part for him. Expensive watch catching the fluorescent light. Shoes polished to a shine that no busy doctor should have had time to maintain. He carried a tablet under one arm and wore the particular expression of someone for whom other people's pain was primarily an administrative concern. General Cartwright, your daughter's post-operative vitals are stable, Hargrove said, not bothering with preamble. He gestured at Emma with the kind of clinical distance that made the child seem more like a problem set than a person. The cochlear implant should integrate within another 72 hours. We're monitoring for rejection, infection, and neural integration issues. Standard protocol. Emma flinched at his voice, not from understanding the words, but from the sharp, authoritative tone of it. The girl's hands trembled. Sarah watched this and made a decision. She set the chart down on the edge of the desk and kept her voice low, level, the voice of someone offering information, not making suggestions. Doctor, I've observed that Emma communicates more effectively through visual methods. She appears to have sign language fluency. If we could coordinate with speech-language pathology to integrate sign communication during her post-operative recovery period, it might reduce her anxiety levels and potentially improve her neurological adjustment to the implant. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Dr. Hargrove turned his full attention to Sarah, his expression shifting into something colder, something with edges. Floor nurses, he said, his voice carrying the kind of measured contempt usually reserved for conversations with people 3 ranks below you, should stick to vital signs and comfort care. Not playing therapist. Not diagnosing psychological interventions. Not second-guessing the protocol established by this hospital's audiology department. He didn't say the words cruelly, that would have been smaller, easier to dismiss. He said them with the particular certainty of someone for whom his own authority was so complete that it never required raising his voice. Is my meaning clear? General Cartwright's jaw tightened. His hands pressed into the arms of the chair, and Sarah could see the moment he registered what had happened. A medical professional had just been publicly humiliated in his presence, in front of his daughter, for suggesting something that might help his child. Sarah turned her attention back to the monitor. She didn't look at Hargrove. She didn't look at the general. She breathed in through her nose, held it for 2 seconds, and released it slowly. Control. She'd learned control in places where the alternative to control was death. She'd learned it in a burning Humvee outside Baghdad while her spine sang with hot shrapnel and her hands worked anyway, doing the work that needed doing even as her body was failing. She could learn it again now, here, in a pediatric hospital room where the weapon was words instead of explosives. She turned to face Hargrove, and when she did, she let a single tear escape. Just one. It rolled down her cheek, catching the harsh fluorescent light. Her hands remained steady. Her voice remained level. My son served under General Cartwright in Fallujah, she said quietly, meeting Hargrove's eyes without wavering. In the Jolin district. I know what honor looks like, Doctor. And this isn't it. The silence that followed was different from the first one. Harder. Denser. Sarah wiped the tear from her cheek, not hurried, not furtive, just a simple gesture of acknowledgement, and returned her attention to Emma's chart. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She was simply a floor nurse doing her job, and if there was something in that statement that had carried weight beyond the words themselves, well, that was nobody's business but her own. General Cartwright stared at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked at Hargrove, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and regret. Sarah pushed through the double doors at 12:24 p.m., lunch tray in hand, turkey sandwich, apple, a bottle of water she wouldn't finish. 3 younger nurses sat at the corner table, their laughter filling the fluorescent-lit silence like something alive and hungry. They didn't notice her at first. Then they did. One of them glanced up. Then the other 2 followed her gaze. The laughter died so completely it felt orchestrated. Sarah set her tray down at the empty table by the window. The only sound was the scrape of her chair against linoleum. Actually, one of the nurses said, Brittany, 3rd shift supervisor, we were just heading back. She stood. Gathered her salad. Her 2 colleagues followed without speaking, their movements synchronized like a choreographed exit. The scraping of 3 chairs. The soft thud of the door closing. The hum of the refrigerator that suddenly sounded impossibly loud. Sarah sat alone with her sandwich untouched. Outside the window, Norfolk rain hammered the parking lot in sheets. Somewhere in the hospital, a child was terrified. Somewhere in a room on the third floor, General Cartwright was losing his daughter one moment at a time, and Sarah was sitting in a break room that had just erased her from existence. She didn't move. Didn't eat. Just stared at the rain until 1:15 p.m., when her break ended and she returned to the floor with the same measured pace she'd maintained since arriving in Norfolk 20 years ago, the pace of someone who'd learned that drawing attention was the fastest way to disappear. By week's end, Dr. Marcus Hargrove had ensured no one would forget her presence, just for entirely different reasons. The write-up was posted on the unit bulletin board at 7:03 a.m. on Friday, laminated and pinned with a red thumbtack like a wanted poster. Sarah saw the staff pause when they passed it, their eyes scanning the text before moving on with the particular kind of pity reserved for people in free fall. She read it once, standing alone in the hallway, her breathing controlled and even. The language was calculated. Each phrase was a small knife, placed deliberately. Not gross negligence. Not incompetence. Something worse, the implication that she had ambitions beyond her station, that she'd reached for something that didn't belong to her. The word *overstepping* appeared twice. Sarah's jaw tightened. Just that. A barely visible clenching of muscle. Then she moved on. Dr. Hargrove was waiting for her in Emma's room that afternoon. The general stood by the window, looking older than he had 5 days ago. The kind of older that came from fear, not time. "Nurse Chen," Hargrove said, his voice performing concern like an actor hitting a mark. He held the formal write-up in his hand, her copy, printed on hospital letterhead. "I wanted to deliver this personally rather than have it catch you off guard. I'm sure you understand these things are never pleasant, but they're necessary for patient safety. Hierarchy exists in medicine for a reason." Sarah's eyes moved from Hargrove to the write-up to General Cartwright's face. The general was watching her with something like recognition, something like shame. "I understand, Dr. Hargrove," Sarah said. Her voice was exactly level. Not apologetic. Not defensive. The voice of someone confirming a weather forecast. "Good. I'm glad we're on the same page." He placed the document on the bedside table. "Going forward, all suggestions regarding Emma's care will go directly through me. No more freelancing, no more alternative approaches. Standard pediatric trauma protocols only. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear." He left. The door closed with the soft whisper of controlled air pressure, and Sarah turned to check Emma's for line. The girl was asleep, her small frame barely disturbing the hospital sheets, her weight visibly less than it had been 2 weeks ago. Muscle atrophy was already visible in her arms. Pediatric malnutrition happened fast when the mind refused what the body needed. General Cartwright stepped closer. "You served," he said quietly. "Not a question." "A long time ago, sir. Long enough to know how to read a room." He paused. "My son mentioned you once. Said you had steadier hands than anyone in his platoon. Said you saved 3 Marines in Fallujah when the convoy rolled. Pulled them out before the ammunition started cooking." Sarah's hands, which had been perfectly steady, suddenly felt very visible to her. Very exposed. "Staff Sergeant David Chen," the general continued, "was one of the finest Marines I ever recommended for commendation. Silver Star. He wrote about you in his final letter home. Said if it wasn't for Senior Chief Chen, he wouldn't have made it to see his daughter born." Cartwright's voice fractured slightly on *daughter star. "He wrote that you had the kind of courage that didn't need a title." Sarah couldn't move. Not because she was frozen, she'd trained out of that response in Baghdad, but because moving would mean acknowledging what was happening. What she'd buried. Who she'd become. "Your son was an extraordinary Marine, sir." "Was?" The general looked at Emma. "I didn't know he was your son until I saw your name on the floor roster. I nearly asked for you immediately. But I was waiting to see how you'd approach her. Testing you." He turned away. "I was right. She calms when you're in the room. That's not placebo. That's not overstepping. That's a trained medical professional recognizing patterns of psychological distress that standard protocols can't address. Dr. Hargrove believes. I know what Dr. Hargrove believes. I've known men like him for 40 years. Competent until competence threatens their authority. Then they become dangerous. The door opened. Security. 2 officers Sarah recognized from the lobby, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professionally neutral. Nurse Chen, one of them said. Not unkindly, but with the particular firmness of people reading from a script. We've been asked to escort you from Emma's case effective immediately. Reassignment pending. Hargrove stood in the hallway behind them, his smile small and satisfied. Like a card player who'd just watched his bluff succeed. Sarah gathered her stethoscope from the bedside table. She didn't look at Hargrove. She looked at Emma, who was waking up, her small body tensing as she registered the uniforms, the authority, the removal of the one face in this hospital that hadn't worn fear or pity. Emma's hands began to move in signs Sarah had taught her. Slow, urgent, stay. Please stay. Sarah's hands responded automatically, 20 years of muscle memory translating her spine into a language Emma could understand. I will be here. You will be safe. It wasn't true. But it was all she had. She walked out with the security officers trailing, and nobody in that hallway, not the nurses, not the residents, not Dr. Hargrove standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, understood that what they were watching was a woman choosing not to shatter. The parking lot rain was warm and aggressive. Sarah sat in her 2009 Civic for 43 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, her breathing the only sound except for the percussion of storm against glass. In her locker at the hospital, her husband's combat boots sat in a paper bag on the bottom shelf, pressed against her spare scrubs. She'd carried those boots with her through every job, every city, every name she'd adopted. They were the only part of the life before Norfolk that she'd allowed to stay. Her phone buzzed. A text from the charge nurse, reassigned to surgical recovery, nights. Start Monday. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was lying in bed that night, unable to sleep, knowing that every hour she wasn't on the pediatric floor was an hour Emma's fear was growing, an hour the girl's psychological state was deteriorating into something that would require more than medication to repair. And that wasn't the worst part either. The worst part was realizing that Hargrove wasn't done. This was escalation. This was calculated. This was someone moving through stages of a plan whose final destination she couldn't see. And she'd walked right into it with her eyes open, believing her competence would protect her the way it had protected her in Baghdad. It hadn't then either. It just meant she survived longer than most. The surgical recovery floor smelled like antiseptic and defeat. Sarah pushed the med cart down the 4th floor corridor at 6 in the morning, her left leg dragging slightly more than usual, the phantom pain from the shrapnel scar in her spine announcing itself with every step, a metronome of reminders that some injuries never quiet down, they just learn to hide better. 2 days had passed since Hargrove removed her from pediatrics. 2 days of being deliberately reassigned to post-op patients she didn't know, recovery schedules that meant working nights with skeleton crews, and the systematic erasure of her from any unit where she might actually matter. The fluorescent lights cast everything in the color of institutional indifference. She moved between rooms checking vitals, adjusting for rates, documenting the mundane measurements that filled the hours. Stable. Stable. Improving. The same words, different patients. Her hands performed the work flawlessly because they were trained for so much worse. They had started fours in the dust of forward operating base warrior with rounds incoming, had applied tourniquets to Marines with missing limbs while explosions rattled the walls of the aid station. These post-operative drains and central lines were muscle memory in its quietest form. But her mind was on the 4th floor of pediatrics. Emma Cartwright occupied the space where Sarah's actual attention lived. She couldn't stop replaying the last moments in the girl's room, the way Emma's fingers had moved across the tablet Sarah had slipped her, the slow recognition that here was a child who understood visual language the way most people understood sound. ASL. Finger spelling. Pictures. Not another doctor leaning over the bed speaking louder as if volume could cross the bridge that deafness had built between them. Emma needed someone who grasped that communication wasn't about sound, it was about signal. Pattern. Intent. The same language Sarah had used for 18 years, reading her teammates' eyes, their hand signals, the way a person moved when they were terrified versus injured versus lying. She wasn't supposed to care this much. Wasn't supposed to feel the weight of the child like a stone in her chest. Around 10 in the morning, one of the charge nurses, Melissa, the one who'd covered for Sarah twice during Hargrove's early campaign, passed her in the supply closet. They didn't speak openly. They didn't need to. Melissa slipped a folded piece of paper into the pocket of Sarah's scrub jacket with the practiced gesture of someone handing off classified documents. Sarah didn't look at it until she was alone in the break room, the door locked and the ancient television in the corner muted on some daytime court show nobody watched. The handwriting was Melissa's, Emma's condition deteriorating. No neurochecks for 36 hours. Her breathing patterns changing. Hargrove ordered private room. Only his assigned staff. Says it's the expected progression. It's not. Sarah read it 3 times. The paper was thin, the kind of evidence that burned easily, that left no trace. She burned it anyway, watching the edges curl black in the sink before running water over the ashes. The information stayed. That was the point. Information was the only weapon she had left. She spent her break in the hospital's records room, technically off-limits without authorization, another violation to add to the file Hargrove was methodically building against her, and pulled Emma's chart. The printed pages smelled like old paper and decisions. She spread them across an empty desk in the back corner where the security cameras had a blind spot she'd memorized months ago during those first weeks of learning the building's architecture the way soldiers learned terrain. The pattern revealed itself in data points. Emma's oxygen saturation had begun trending downward 3 days ago, subtle, not alarming to casual observation. 98. 97. 96. 94. The child's respiration rate climbing incrementally. Heart rate elevated but not enough to trigger standard alarm thresholds. And the notes, every single note from Hargrove's assigned staff documented only the obvious findings, nothing more. Pediatric hearing loss. Difficulty with communication. Behavioral challenges. Nobody was looking deeper. Nobody was asking why a previously stable child was showing signs of developing pulmonary complications, signs that in Sarah's experience with Baghdad trauma cases often preceded something worse, something catastrophic. A tension pneumothorax didn't announce itself with grand gestures. It whispered. It crept. It waited until the lungs had compressed enough that breathing became impossible, and by then it was already a code blue. Sarah had seen 14 of them in Baghdad. 8 had survived the field. 3 had made it to Germany. 1 had died on the transport plane. The young girl in the private room on the pediatric floor was showing every early indicator that her body was preparing for exactly that scenario. Sarah photographed the pages with her phone, another violation, layers upon layers of rule-breaking accumulating like sediment, and left the chart exactly as she'd found it. Her leg ached as she stood, the compensation in her gait making her left hip scream a dull protest that radiated down toward her ankle. The phantom pain mixed with actual pain, war injury, and present reality overlapping until she couldn't distinguish between what had happened in Baghdad and what was happening now in Norfolk. Emma reminded her too much of her son. Not in appearance, the girl was small and dark-haired and 8 years old, nothing like the lanky 17-year-old who barely spoke to Sarah anymore, who left for school before she woke and came home after she slept. But something in the quality of her silence. Some children were quiet because they lacked words. Emma was quiet because the world had taken a fundamental way of being herself, and she'd learned to move through the hospital the way soldiers moved through hostile territory, alert, self-contained, trusting nobody. Sarah understood that language. She spoke it fluently. That evening, as she was clocking out, she walked past the front desk where General Cartwright was sitting in the waiting area. He wasn't in his uniform, just a man in his 60s, hollow-eyed and waiting, the way fathers waited when their children were failing and medicine had no better answers. She didn't approach him. She didn't need to. Instead, she stopped at the information desk and asked the receptionist for a patient message envelope. The woman, Sandra, who'd worked there for 12 years and had seen enough hospital drama to fill a novel nobody would believe, handed one over without comment. Sarah wrote in block letters with a ballpoint pen, Emma's respiratory status declining. Oxygen saturation trending down since day 3 post-admission. Breathing rate elevated. Pattern suggests early pneumothorax development. Monitor intercostal retractions. Listen for diminished breath sounds right lung. She'll need sign language interpreter for emergency consent. She won't trust verbal instructions. General Cartwright needs to know. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. She folded the message and wrote the general's name on the envelope, then slipped it into the hospital message system. Not official. Not connected to her. Plausible deniability all the way down. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 hours after she left, Sarah received a call from the security desk supervisor. Routine. Professional. Ms. Chen, we need to review some footage from the records room on your break today. Can you come back in? She heard what he wasn't saying. Security footage. Records access logs. A documented pattern of unauthorized access, now twice. Hargrove had eyes in more places than she'd calculated. He'd been moving faster than she'd anticipated, consolidating his case, building layers of evidence that transformed boundary violations into something closer to insubordination. The note she'd left for the general, he would trace that too, given enough time. He would connect it to her surveillance, match the timing, and present it to the hospital board as proof of deliberate interference with another physician's treatment plan. She didn't go back in. Instead, she drove to her apartment, a studio above a Vietnamese restaurant in the older part of Norfolk where the rents didn't require explaining gaps in employment history, and opened her locker. The combat boots sat on the bottom shelf, wrapped in the same plastic bag they'd occupied for 4 years. Her husband's boots. Not hers. She'd never worn them. They were the only thing she'd kept from the life before nursing, before she'd decided that disappearing into anonymity was the only way to survive the weight of what she'd seen, what she'd done, what she'd failed to prevent. She sat on the edge of her bed and held the boots in her lap like they might crumble if she didn't handle them carefully enough. 20 years of quiet. 20 years of being invisible. 20 years of convincing herself that the price of peace was acceptable, that trading her name for her sanity was an even exchange. Then her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Mercy General Security. Dr. Hargrove has filed a formal complaint. Hospital administration requires your presence at an investigative meeting tomorrow, 0800 hours. Bring all credentials and employment documentation. This is mandatory. Sarah set the boots back in their plastic bag and lay down on top of her covers without undressing. Outside, rain had begun to fall on Norfolk, the kind of autumn rain that sounded like artillery against the window glass, that hammered the old building as if trying to break through to the other side of things. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain and understood with the clarity that only comes after a decade and a half of running, that running had never actually worked. Hargrove wasn't trying to destroy her because she'd overstepped. He was trying to destroy her because on some level, despite his arrogance and his institutional power and his ability to navigate hospital politics like a politician working a room, he recognized something in her competence that terrified him. He'd seen a child respond to her where no other staff member could reach, and instead of recognizing that as strength, he'd recognized it as a threat. At midnight, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Senior Chief. The voice was older, steady, with that particular timbre that came from 20-plus years of command. This is General Cartwright. I found your message. I know who you are. And I need you to listen to me very carefully, because my daughter is running out of time. The 4th floor pediatrics unit erupted into chaos at 2:02 a.m. Sarah heard it from the stairwell, the high-pitched alarm of a crashing monitor, a resident's panicked voice calling for help, the shuffle of feet that meant nobody knew what they were doing. Her limp was pronounced as she ran, her left leg protesting the speed, but muscle memory didn't care about pain. Pain was information. Pain meant urgency. Emma's room was a storm of incompetence. The little girl sat upright in bed, her small chest heaving, lips the color of a winter sky, that particular shade of blue that meant the oxygen wasn't getting through. Her eyes were wide with terror, seeking help from people who couldn't hear her silence. The on-duty resident, a third-year named Dr. Patel, was fumbling with an oxygen mask, his hands moving without purpose. In the hallway, visible through the open door, Dr. Hargrove stood with his phone pressed to his ear, still trying to call in specialists, still processing bureaucracy while a child suffocated in front of him. Sarah didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She moved into the room with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this 100 times before, in places where hesitation meant body bags. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis was written across Emma's body in clinical shorthand: unilateral breath sounds absent, tracheal deviation, hypertension creeping in as the collapsed lung compressed her heart. The kid had maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest became inevitable. "Step back," Sarah said to Dr. Patel, her voice dropping 2 octaves into something that wasn't a request. It was a command. It was the voice of a senior chief petty officer who had walked into burning homes and brought people out alive. She was already moving. Her hands knew the geography of this emergency the way they knew Baghdad, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She didn't need the tray they were fumbling to prepare. She had a 14-gauge angiocath needle in her pocket, because a floor nurse who had lived through 2004 Fallujah never walked into a pediatric unit unprepared. Her fingers found the landmarks on Emma's thin chest with absolute precision. No tremor. No doubt. Just the muscle memory of 100 battlefield traumas compressed into 5 seconds of perfect execution. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that sound like a tire deflating, like pressure finally releasing, like a child getting a chance to breathe. Emma's chest rose. Color flooded back into her face in waves, from gray to pink to something that resembled living. Her small hands gripped the bed rail, her body still shaking but breathing now, actually breathing, oxygen finally reaching her starved tissues. Her eyes found Sarah's face and locked there with the intensity of someone who had just been saved by a ghost. General Cartwright watched from the doorway in stunned silence. The man had commanded Marines. He had seen combat. He had made impossible decisions in impossible places. And in this moment, he was just a father watching a floor nurse move with the confidence of a combat surgeon. Dr. Hargrove entered the room. His face went the color of old bone. "You just performed an unauthorized invasive procedure," he said, his voice shaking, not with anger, with fear. The fear of a man who understood exactly what he was watching and what it meant for his narrative. "This is a gross violation of protocol. Security. Escort Nurse Chen from the building immediately." Sarah removed her gloves with deliberate calm. Each movement was a period at the end of a sentence. She looked once at Emma, breathing peacefully now, her small fingers still gripping the bed rail. She looked once at General Cartwright, whose expression had shifted from shock to something that resembled recognition. Then she walked out between 2 security officers, her gait steady despite the fire in her spine where shrapnel had lodged itself 18 years ago. Behind her, Hargrove's phone was already in his hand. She heard him before she reached the elevator. "Douglas, it's Marcus. We have a serious liability issue. She needs to be terminated immediately and her license suspended pending full investigation. I want her gone before shift change." The security officers didn't speak. They escorted her to the main entrance in the pre-dawn darkness, where the rain had intensified into something that sounded like applause. One of them, a younger guy, maybe 24, looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm just following orders." Sarah nodded. She understood orders. Orders were what had kept her alive for 12 years in the Navy. Orders were what had killed her husband 6 years after she left. By the time the morning shift arrived, her credentials were under formal review. By 8 a.m., a certified letter sat in her mailbox at home informing her that her nursing license was temporarily suspended pending investigation. By 10 a.m., she was driving through the rain to Riverside Cemetery on the edge of Norfolk, her hand steady on the wheel despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. The grave was in the older section, under an oak tree that hadn't yet shed all its leaves. Master Sergeant William Chen, 1976 to 2010. Beloved husband. Father. Soldier. The headstone didn't mention PTSD. It didn't mention the 3 years of nightmares, the way he'd wake up screaming, the morning she found him in the garage with the car running and a note that said, "I'm sorry, I can't be the man you married anymore." It didn't mention any of that because stone can only hold so much truth. Sarah knelt in the rain, her scrub soaked through within seconds. She'd brought something with her, the combat boots from her locker, the one she'd been carrying for 6 years like a penitent carrying stones. The leather was cracked and stained. Dust from Fallujah still lived in the treads. She set them down at the base of the headstone. "I tried to save Cartwright's little girl," she whispered, and her voice broke like old wood. "I tried and I failed you again. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending I'm not broken." The rain fell harder. A car passed on the distant street. Somewhere in the hospital she'd just been escorted from, Emma Cartwright was breathing normally, her small lungs filling with air that Sarah had fought for. And somewhere in the machinery of bureaucracy, Dr. Hargrove was already writing his narrative, already building his case, already deciding that a flaw nurse who overstepped her boundaries was a liability that needed to be eliminated completely. Sarah knelt there until her knees went numb. Until the rain had soaked through to her skin. Until she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like drowning, that she had spent 20 years trying to disappear and it had all been for nothing. The past didn't let you go just because you stopped looking at it. The past waited. The past was patient. The past was standing at the graveside of a man who died because Sarah had tried to be someone she wasn't. She didn't know, as she drove away from the cemetery, that someone had been watching. She didn't know that General Cartwright had called his contacts at Naval Hospital Portsmouth before Emma even stabilized. She didn't know that her employment file was already on its way to people who understood exactly what a Navy Cross meant. She didn't know that in 3 days, the truth would walk into that hospital board meeting like a door finally breaking open. All she knew was the weight of the rain and the silence of the dead and the absolute certainty that she had nothing left to lose. 3 days later, the hospital board conference room smelled like stale coffee and polished mahogany. Sarah sat alone at the long table, no lawyer beside her, no union representative, no one. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in corpse gray. She wore her scrubs still, she hadn't bothered changing. One hand rested flat on the table. The other was hidden in her lap, the trembling not fear, it was restraint. The board members filed in like pallbearers. Patricia Reynolds, the board chairwoman, wouldn't meet her eyes. Frank Morrison, risk management, was already taking notes. Douglas Whitmore, the hospital president and Hargrove's golf partner, sat closest to Hargrove himself, who arrived last, his chin elevated, his posture that of a man convinced he'd already won. "We have reviewed the incident report," Patricia began, her voice the texture of dry paper. "An unauthorized invasive procedure. The State Medical Board has flagged your license for review. We have no choice but to recommend permanent termination and full credential revocation." Sarah didn't blink. She didn't shift. Muscle memory took over, the same stillness she'd learned in Baghdad when shrapnel was still singing through the air. She would listen. She would absorb. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. The door at the back of the conference room burst open. Her son, Marcus, 17 years old, stood in the frame clutching a shadow box, his chest heaving, his voice cracking with an anger that belonged to a soldier, not a child. "Mom, they need to see these. They need to see what you actually are." The room went dead silent. General Cartwright stood. Not slowly. Immediately. His chair scraped back with the sound of a weapon being chambered. When he spoke, His voice was ice. "Senior Chief Petty Officer." The words landed like a salute. The board members looked at each other. Sarah's jaw tightened, just barely. She hadn't known her son knew the full rank. She hadn't known he'd kept those boxes. Patricia Reynolds took the shadow box from Marcus with trembling hands. Inside, medals caught the fluorescent light like stars. She read aloud, her voice strengthening with each word. 3 Navy Commendation Medals. A pause. Sarah's eyes finally moved. She looked at her son. 2 Bronze Stars. The board members leaned forward. This was not the profile of a nurse. This was not the history of a floor staff member. The conference room door opened again. A man in dress blue stood in the frame, still in uniform, his sleeves dense with insignia. A SEAL team commander, visiting his own daughter down in pediatrics, had heard the commotion in the hallway. He stepped inside without permission because he didn't need permission. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that comes from having survived things the board members couldn't conceptualize. Combat Action Ribbon. He nodded to Patricia, who was still holding the box. Purple Heart. And a Navy Cross for pulling 8 Marines from a burning Humvee in Baghdad while taking shrapnel to her spine. He looked directly at Hargrove. That's the woman you tried to bury. The hospital IT director, Frank Mercer, a former 75th Ranger Regiment veteran who'd been waiting in the hallway, his hand drive already in his pocket, walked to the front of the room and connected his laptop to the projector. Frank had been waiting for this moment. He pulled up security footage from Emma's crash 3 days prior. The timestamp, 2:02 a.m. Emma's vital signs began dropping. The screen showed Sarah entering the pediatric ICU, hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, maybe 2,000. The needle going in at the second intercostal space. The hiss of air escaping. The O2 sat rising. 75, 82. 88, stable. Sinus rhythm. Then the next timestamp, 2:52 a.m. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the footage, walking calmly toward the room, checking his phone, making no attempt to move faster. The timestamp jumped, 2:57 a.m. Hargrove was still in the hallway, consulting with a resident about weekend vacation schedules. The timestamp jumped again, 3:04 a.m. Sarah was already completing post-procedure stabilization. Hargrove was finally entering the room, looking confused. Frank turned off the projector. Every frame is preserved and already reported to the State Medical Board. He looked directly at Patricia. He also tried to delete this footage yesterday. The deletion logs show the attempt. That's obstruction. Dr. Hargrove's face went from red to white, a transformation so complete that even Douglas Whitmore stood up and stepped away from him, distancing himself the way a rat leaves a sinking ship. That footage is taken out of context, Hargrove said, his voice cracking. I was consulting with specialists about her care and the SEAL commander cut him off. I watched the footage, Doctor. You were booking a golf resort. The silence that followed was so thick you could perform surgery in it. General Cartwright's voice was ice again. You knew enough to try to bury her, Douglas. You both did. He looked at Whitmore, then at Hargrove, then back at Patricia. You knew enough. Within the hour, the State Medical Board opened a formal investigation. Within 24 hours, security footage revealed not just Hargrove's delayed response to Emma's crisis, but a pattern: 3 previous nurses targeted and forced into resignation, all women, all with records clean as surgical steel until he decided they threatened his authority. 2 formal complaints buried by administrative friends. Email chains showing Hargrove coordinating with board members to handle the Chen problem before her heroic actions made her termination legally complicated. Frank Morrison, confronted with liability exposure that could bankrupt the hospital, personally apologized to Sarah and offered full reinstatement with 6 months back pay. General Cartwright went further, leveraging connections that made phone calls untraceable, ensuring both Hargrove and Whitmore faced consequences. 6 weeks later, Dr. Marcus Hargrove surrendered his medical license rather than face a public hearing. His network evaporated. Former allies suddenly didn't return calls. Board connections denied they'd ever supported him closely. His wife filed for divorce when the full scope became public. His country club suspended his membership. Applications to other hospitals were rejected before they reached human hands. The medical community was smaller than he'd realized, and Sarah's story had spread like a virus through every hospital in a 3-state radius. 2 years later, Sarah ran Mercy General's new pediatric trauma unit. The hospital board named it after William, the Master Sergeant William Chen Pediatric Trauma Center. She trained residents and nurses in battlefield triage techniques, authority unquestioned, her legend openly celebrated instead of hidden. On Emma's 10th birthday, the little girl walked into Sarah's office during afternoon rounds. Emma carried a drawing. Sarah recognized her daughter's careful hand immediately. The girl had learned to draw in therapy, another thing Sarah had helped coordinate. Emma placed the picture on Sarah's desk. It showed a nurse wearing a cape, standing beside a pair of carefully sketched combat boots, rendered in Emma's favorite colors, gold and blue. Emma signed slowly, her small hands moving with precision her surgeon said should never have been possible. Sarah signed back, both of them smiling, and for the first time in 20 years, Sarah allowed herself to believe that honor had been restored. Marcus, now a pre-med student, volunteered in his mother's unit 3 days a week, watching her teach residents, watching them watch her, the way they looked at her when she made a decision, the way they trusted her without question. General Cartwright visited regularly, bringing Emma for follow-ups, but really to check on Sarah, the woman who had saved both his daughter and his son, even though she hadn't known she was saving two. Commander Walsh started stopping by her office with coffee, part of a veteran support group. They'd formed at the hospital, 5 other military veterans working in civilian healthcare, all of them finally tired of hiding. Patricia Reynolds approved funding for 3 more trauma-trained nursing positions. On a rain-soaked evening, Sarah visited the cemetery, but this time she wasn't crying. She placed flowers on William's grave and told him about Emma's progress, about the cochlear implant that was changing the girl's life, about the unit bearing his name. She told him that she could finally honor who she had been without being destroyed by it. As she walked back to her car, Marcus was waiting by the entrance. He handed her the combat boots, cleaned, restored, laces replaced. Boots that belonged to someone who'd carried lives. These belong in your office, Mom. Not hidden away. Sarah took them, the leather warm against her hands, and nodded. The next morning, the boots sat on her shelf. Emma's picture beside them. Her office door was always open. A group of young nurses gathered around her desk while she taught them how to assess respiratory distress in nonverbal children, how to trust your hands when your brain wanted to panic, how to stay still when the world was breaking. Her voice was clear. Her authority was absolute. She moved through her shifts like someone finally at peace, like someone who'd stopped running, like someone who'd stopped pretending. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to know that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. And comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's hear your story.